A lot of those coastal communities not necessarily looking for a lot of funding. What they need is dignified livelihoods. So they need market access. And if you're not formalized, you can't raise funding. You can't even go to a bank and, get a loan or whatever. There's no financing. There's no real hiring either. So you can still hire people informally and just pay them, but there's no stability. And without that stability, there can't be any growth. And they're stuck in that informality trap. The other reason is because they have very limited market access, whether it be because of logistics. In the blue space, for example, there's a lot of standards that you need to meet, especially in the blue foods sector, before you can access formal markets, hygiene standards and things like that.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this new episode of the Fundraising Insiders podcast, the podcast where we usually put what's behind the check and we put it inside the deck. Today, we're going to do something a little bit different. We are even going to change our format. For those who are used to the 20 minutes of introduction, what the guest does, how we got there, then 20 minutes of rapid fire questioning, and then a bit of a improvisation and deep dive topics. Here, we are going to work quite chronologically because we have with us Alexis. Alexis is the founder of OceanHub Africa, which is something that started with an original idea, with an original end goal. Alexis, today you're going to tell us that, it was everything but a straight line. And there were learnings along the way. And you went from thinking, we want to develop this ecosystem and support it, to having a venture builder, an accelerator, doing some ecosystem development, trying, failing, trying again. And more lately, you have the development of your own VC fund and all the learnings along the way. So Alexis, please introduce yourself. Who are you? How you got into doing what you're doing? And please tell us all about it.
Hi, Thibaut. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. And I'm very excited to be able to unpack everything with you, and honored that we're changing the format for this special occasion. Thank you very much. So my name is Alexis. I'm the founder of OceanHub Africa. I'm an environmental engineer by academic background, originally French, and moved to South Africa in 2017. And I had a first life here as a social impact incubator manager. And I realized here in Cape Town, at the crossroads of three oceans, Southern, Indian, and Atlantic Ocean, with a good economy, good city that's working well and that has to offer a lot of opportunities in terms of ocean industries, that there was a lot to leverage in the ocean space, but also how vulnerable the ocean would be in the face of a big city. And that really struck me when there was a huge storm the one weekend, and I saw how powerful the ocean is. And then the next day, it was heartbreaking, because obviously Cape Town is very hilly and mountainous, and all the water and the rain dredged everything, and including pollution and a lot of things into the ocean, and the ocean was in a devastating state around Cape Town. So how vulnerable it was in that sense. And I realized that there was something big to be done here. And having a conversation with a friend, he dropped the word. We were talking about, do something about the ocean and, ocean sustainability, etc. And he dropped that word ocean tech, which I had never heard before. And he had just made up when we were talking about, we were both in tech before. I was like, wow, it clicked. It was obvious for me. Like, Ocean Tech Cape Town. So actually, OceanHub Africa, this name, before it was incorporated, the idea was pitched under the name Ocean Tech Cape Town. And what we wanted to do then was to accelerate African-based, ocean-minded entrepreneurs. The term blue economy, the expression blue economy, was barely coined then. It wasn't used a lot. I had never heard of it. And I just went around and pitched to a few people in the tech sector that I was already a part of in Cape Town, this idea of Ocean Tech Cape Town. And it just stated the title, the label, and everybody's like, I love it. Obviously, it's like an obvious thing. Ocean Tech Cape Town, okay, speaks for itself. No need to unpack any further, no need to pitch any longer. I'm going to try to support. So everybody wanted to raise their hand, they wanted to support, but no one really would put any dime behind it. I was like, I want to support. It's like, okay, how so? Like, I'll give you a pat on the back. Okay, cheers, mate. Thanks.
Everyone's happy to support until they got to put the money in, or the hand in the wallet, as we say. It's like,
prove yourself first. Okay, how so? It's a chicken and egg. But it makes sense. I think I understand the approach. But so most of them were more supportive in terms of, they were pitching the idea to other people and then connecting, and so it's all network, sharing their networks and helping to spread the word in such a way that very rapidly this thing picked up and the ball was rolling faster than I could keep up with. And and got a few people on board.
At this first stage, what was when you say you pitched the idea, what was the core direction you were giving? Say, what was your elevator pitch? Because Ocean Tech Cape Town, apart from rolling really nicely off the tongue, Ocean Tech Cape Town, it's like,
Yeah,
it clicks well. But
that
what
was
was the idea behind it? Was it, we are just going to support the ocean economy? Like, okay, what kind of economy are we talking? What kind of support are we talking? Are we raising funding? Are we developing the economy? What was maybe
the
the
reason
top
behind it.
2 or 3 things that you thought, okay, this is what we need to get done to set the foundation before we can go forward? What was the first things to do on that part?
Yeah, thanks. It's a good question. There was more than 2, 3 things. I'll tell you without unpacking the whole theory of change, but close to. I'll tell you what was the thinking. Why do something around Ocean Tech Cape Town and those things? Beyond the fact that it was really sitting at the nexus of where I had experience, what I'm passionate about, what serves, could put bread on the table and serves a greater purpose than just bread on the table, which is otherwise known as the ikigai, right? Your raison d'être, your purpose. So that was one good reason that drove me. But more generally, how this would fit into the bigger picture. Today, we live in an era where the definition of progress has changed. It used to be whatever derives economic value is the main anchor, with social benefits. If you tie the two together, then you were progressing, you were moving forward, you're elevating yourself or your organization or society. This is still today, right? We still need to derive economic value with social benefits, tied to social benefits, but within planetary boundaries. That new parameter is a paradigm shift altogether.
So it's adding the E in ESG, the environmental part. You've got, we already had the social governance and the financial, and we're adding the E in there, right? In a way.
Exactly. Yes. ESG. I don't know if governance is one thing, but it was even more. It was more profit making, right? So it was progress had to be deriving economic value, social benefits within, planetary boundaries. So the environment, yes, the environmental impact is the new parameter,
right?
And that new definition of progress needed to be embraced, obviously, because we all want to progress as society and individuals. And the way we could change that, because that is a change, we need to implement it at scale and at a fast pace because we're running out of time. And we all know about the SDGs. We needed to go beyond science and education, which inform and help to inform change. Science helps to inform change, and education drives people to change their behaviors. Policy helps to also drive change based on information given or taken from science. But the only way to implement the change is through business. Businesses implement the change. So we needed to work in that space in particular because we had been talking for a while, and implementation of change must go through business. So we want to work in the business space and help them embrace this new definition of progress. But the reality, given the scale and the pace of the challenge, is that we can't do it incrementally so much. We need to disrupt the way business is being done. Business disruption has a label. It's called startups, right? So we say, okay, cool, we're going to support startups. And why particularly in the ocean space? Because the ocean is our best ally against climate change. And it's the one ecosystem that touches upon all SDGs in one go. And just so happened that it's the largest untapped economic potential of our planet. It ticks all of the boxes. And taking this approach of supporting entrepreneurs that can help shift businesses, towards a more sustainable, more people and nature positive approach, we are working to shift things from within. So we're using the system to spin it on its head and build a better future.
Now, let me take a partially educated guess. You mentioned 3 key points where things need to happen: the education, the policy, and the business. Now, you said you wanted to work explicitly on the business because this is how things change. You need to get things done. As everyone knows, when you try to do something, it never works on the first try, or at least it always becomes more complex than you thought it would be. So your original plan was to go to develop the business. From what I understood in a couple of conversations since we've known each other, and even more when you developed this idea in the little call we had before the recording, although you wanted to go directly to business, you still had to do policy and education. So tell us more about this, the realization, maybe the points where you thought, okay, it's not going to be just business. We can't just do supporting startups. There's going to have to be other things around this. The idea around this podcast, of course, is to be industry agnostic, but I feel like the ocean being such a novel industry, and as you said, it's one of the most untapped potential, it's a great framework to study for potential new technologies or new areas of technology that might require the same steps. If there's a new area of technology where, hey, we want to go directly and develop those businesses in this technology, there will always have to be the education and the policy as well. So I'm really glad that today's episode will serve as a blueprint, a case study of how to develop an industry and also a region, because we'll talk also about the particularities of Africa as a continent. So yeah, tell us more about the realization that this straight line of supporting businesses wasn't as straight as you thought, and how you got to those realization and the different steps to get there.
Thanks. Yeah, as I said, we wanted, when we first started, we wanted to be this accelerator, so sort of later stage uh, um, technical assistance facility for ocean-minded entrepreneurs in Africa. And the reality is that there was no pipeline. We looked at it and said, why isn't there any pipeline? I mean, the main reason is probably because people were completely oblivious to the challenges and the potential that lie in the ocean space. Out of sight, out of mind. A lot of things that are happening out there, are unknown to the larger public, and the few that know and leverage it are really having a joel and just thinking about themselves, right? They're not doing it in a very sustainable way. So we started communicating, evangelizing a little bit, raising awareness about the challenges and the opportunities that sit in the ocean space. That there is this massive untapped potential, economic potential. But if we go and tap into the 95% economic potential that we're not tapping into in the same fashion that we've been doing the first 5%, it's going to be a shit show before we even reach 10%. There's a huge opportunity, but there needs to be innovation. We need to do it in a more sustainable way. That was the premises of trying to find entrepreneurs that were already working in an ocean impact space without really having the label, the tag. So it was hard to find them. Then we found them, we started supporting them. We realized they were more, not so much acceleration, but more incubation stages, so earlier stage. So we dialed down a little bit from acceleration to incubation. And we dialed up the ecosystem building effort. And we had to do this quite intensively. We realized there was no point grooming entrepreneurs with a hands-on program if there wasn't a fertile soil to plant the seeds into after the program for it to grow on its own sustainably and thrive. So this is where we went and identified the key stakeholders that we wanted to see in the ocean impact space in Africa and around the world, but we were focusing on the continent. Authorities at all levels, and this is where we started also eventually to do a bit more, I wouldn't say lobbying, but we worked in sort of policies and things like that space. Yep. Investors.
Education is part of this bit as well. When you go to the policy side and governments, you also have to educate them on this whole thing, because they were oblivious as well, I suppose.
Absolutely. And still a lot of work to be done in that space, to be honest. But yes, the short is yes. The other stakeholder group that we were working with that is directly linked to education is more the science part. So science informs the change, right? If you are looking to develop or to build new solutions, at the nexus of the ocean and a triple planetary crisis, pollution, loss of biodiversity, and climate change, you need to have a thorough understanding of what the problems are if you want to fix the problems, if you want to find a solution. And that good understanding sits with science and research. So we went and spoke to connected to universities, research centers, and a lot to better understand how to drive change, whether it be through regulation or technology, improving how businesses operate. And then there was the whole innovation ecosystem, as I was saying, with the investors, the entrepreneurs, the other ESOs, entrepreneurship support organizations, the ocean industries, obviously, and then the NPOs and foundations, the nonprofit organizations and NGOs, because they were the most active in that space at this stage, without necessarily sort of the economic lens of it, but definitely the social and environmental impact lens. So we built that ecosystem. I mean, we supported the catalyzation of that ecosystem around a platform, which we ended up representing at some point in time, and then went on and demonstrated over time the value of incubation and a way of doing it for blue entrepreneurs in Africa. Showed momentum, garnered momentum, groundswell even at some point really felt around ocean economy and sustainable, equitable ocean economy in Africa. And now we're moving that towards regenerative ocean economy in Africa, a step further. And we realized, cool, we've got something here, and the ecosystem has evolved in Africa around blue entrepreneurship, and more people are talking about it. And there was also a groundswell around the topic internationally. It wasn't just in Africa, which also helped. And that was very closely intertwined with the fact that I co-founded in late 2019, 2020, 1,000 Ocean Startups Coalition, which brought together all the ESOs, incubators and accelerators, and the funds, the VC funds that were working towards ocean impact and ocean innovation, to support
Right.
ocean innovation. And so we saw this, and very true to our one of our ethos around, playing the infinite game from Simon Sinek. Not a game where you're trying to win, and you end the game by beating others, but
Mhm.
a game where the aim of the game is to keep on playing, and the way you can keep on playing is by bringing more players
More
constantly,
people.
right? So
Yeah.
that perpetuates the game. So we decided benevolently to hand over, to transfer our skills and our blueprints, for a good pun, to other incubators across Africa, and we supported 27 other incubators in Africa that were doing buzzy stuff like fintech, because that was an easy way for them to get funding, and it's also an asset class that is getting a lot of private capital tractions and things like that. So it seemed to be,
So,
and definitely was, an easier field. Yeah,
so those 27 other incubators were not necessarily blue tech.
they
They
were
were just
not.
incubator. So now so because I think this is really the interesting, the intricacy, I should say, about this podcast is that we have two things. There's sector specific, which is the ocean, and then there is the geographic specific, which is Africa. So what will be interesting to in the end, what we'll try to decorticate this and then rebuild it all the way back is what are the skills. So that's my agnostic mind speaking here. What are the things that are repeatable from the ocean industry to other novel industries, and the things that are repeatable from the African ecosystem to other ecosystems? And the flip side of the mirror is what was so specific about the ocean and what is so specific about Africa. So if you don't mind, let's take a second to talk about this part of the African ecosystem. What was the blueprint that you could re-employ and teach to all of those different, venture builders and incubators within the African ecosystem, but agnostic of the sector? And what was the things that each sector has to do on their own? So how do we separate the repeatable from the non-repeatable, specific to the African ecosystem?
So to the geography, right? Not to the sector.
So yeah,
the industry.
here we're keeping the geography fixed, but
Okay.
we are varying the sectors. So what can you apply
Okay.
to all those different sectors within that one geography?
Okay, right. The ocean is a commons, right? The tragedy of the commons. I guess everyone's familiar with the concept. If not, definitely worth a googling. It essentially means that you can only be as strong as your weakest link, right? In the
Yeah,
process.
gotcha.
So if you move away from from such a sector, if you will, then competition takes a different shape, and it brings a lot of different things. These can be very valuable things. Keeps you on your toes, and keeps you more efficient, and at times a bit more aggressive, which is not always a good thing. The ocean space hasn't got this. I know you've asked what is transferable from ocean to non-ocean space. The concept that where everything emerged initially, which is around the new definition of progress, is agnostic to any sector, right? It's a societal
Right.
thing. And we need to work towards a planet that's more people and nature conscious, right? And the approach that we've taken within OceanHub Africa and the development of the ocean economy, or sustainable ocean economy in Africa, can be replicated across the board. If you have at the center the idea of keeping the impact at heart, that is by bringing again the science first, whatever informs what
Right.
the change should be and what the solutions should look like or to consider, the framework, the enabling framework that supports the adoption of that new knowledge, and that's mostly
Right.
around policy and finance. These are enabling ecosystem or enabling frameworks that will support the development or the adoption or both of new sustainable ocean or agriculture or biotechnologies or this and that, whatever the sector, solutions.
Right.
So I think that is definitely replicable. And that's even both sector and geography agnostic, I would say.
And so to make this replicable, those the articulation of those policy, science, business, etc. How did you implement it in those 27 different incubators? Were there tools that you created? Were there guidelines, frameworks? What is the format in which you got to transfer this across industries throughout the African continent?
Good question. We kept it quite rather simple. We want the hurdles to be the barriers to be low. We're not
Okay.
asking. It was a raising hand exercise. We didn't force any incubators to join the process. We We looked at it, we used the same principles, and we said, most of you incubators out there are living on a money drip. You have grant from DFIs, development funding institutions, that were funding fintech up until now, but increasingly you'll have climate and gender as a requirement for further funding. Just doing fintech is just not going to cut it. So as you grow your climate verticals, think about the ocean, and we're explaining to them why the ocean matters so much and how this could be also an edge, because others, all of the fintechs out there, incubators out there, will all move towards climate tech in one way or another. And, doing ocean there first will give you an edge, a differentiator. And then obviously on top of this, we explain to them the opportunities that are out there and how huge it could be also for them. Then in terms of the transfer of knowledge, we gave them the curriculum that we were using. How is it different when you support an entrepreneur in the blue tech space than it would be in the fintech space or any other spaces for that matter, which is quite close. And we've done that work with 1,000. It was really spoon-fed, but it was given at a high level to them in the trainings. And then they had to adapt, and us backstopping that adaptation to their local and national ecosystems.
Gotcha. So, and now let's take the second layer, which is the geographical one. Here we're talking about things that are, as you said, they're agnostic to industry and also to continents. What are the specificities, the intricacies of the African ecosystem in its own that required maybe further attention that you wouldn't have if you were developing that in the European ecosystem or the American ecosystem, to take the two more developed or more just simply older, so they've had the time to do certain things that maybe the African ecosystem hasn't had the time to do. So what are those things that you had to pay specific care about?
So, the first thing is that you don't raise money on an idea in Africa. It doesn't work like this. In Europe and in the US, if you have a good idea and a decent CV, you can get 3 million euros, US dollars, just because you have a good idea and a good CV. That's the first thing. What helps you define or determine whether you're backing the right horse it's not necessarily also the stack of diplomas that person would have, because again, education is different, and there's different types of education here in Africa that are much more valuable than your standard degrees. And then the second thing I would say is that the vast majority of blue entrepreneurs in Africa aren't your start-upers, are brick and mortar, small scale fishers, seaweed farmers, and things like that, or they come from a community background. Just if you take a step back, there's two types of blue entrepreneurs in Africa. They are your, as I was saying just now, your coastal community-led organizations or small SMEs, small, medium, enterprises that work in the ocean space, and they want to do it, consciously, and they want it to be nature and people positive. And these are hardly scalable, and they're mostly looking around adaptation to changes in their environment, climate change, and loss of biodiversity. And you can replicate what they're doing, but you can't really scale it up, or it would be very weird. On the flip side, there are your startups, and these are tech-enabled. They need technical assistance. They're looking for investment, not market access necessarily, and they work at the nexus of ocean and the mitigation of triple planetary crisis. It's quite different, taking that into consideration, because a lot of the science caters for the majority, a lot of the policy caters for the majority, and these are, in our space, brick and mortar SMEs or MSMEs.
Right.
And instead of your startup. So you have to take that into account when you build the ecosystem. If you want to convene the right number and the right people, you take that into account. But then the amount of love that you give and the approach that you take can be different depending on the stakeholders and your end goals. And for us, we gave all that love and we developed this whole ecosystem around this. We've even developed a program dedicated to coastal communities. And on the flip side, we were building a whole team and dedicating an intense amount of love, and support for the few startups that were starting to emerge one after the other. And
Right.
that was where we banked the most, because on the coastal community development side, there was a simple business model for our organization, and we were growing it and we were having great impact, and it's driving the growth, the initial growth of OceanHub Africa. And we'll still do this and grow this. It's super important for us and the whole team here. But where we were taking out most of our risk, because we didn't get any funding in the beginning, actually, to be honest. And so we were doing the coastal community development during the day, so that during the night we could do this other stuff with supporting the startups. That's what was our gamble.
So the coastal community turned out to be the hidden engine to really bootstrap everything, because it's maybe an easier business model, as you were saying. And once this foundational layer was good, and maybe it also attracted more investment, the startups could start to develop. So do you feel like earlier in the recording you were saying that you were missing the topsoil and maybe the fertilizer, whatever you want to call it, to have the seeds and have them grow? Do you feel like the coastal communities provided a portion of that topsoil for the startups to start emerging?
No, I would. So first, we never exploited coastal communities. Right? We
No,
didn't
no, 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 no. I'm
use
not
that
saying
to make
exploit,
things
of
more,
course.
right? Yeah. But
Sorry.
in our we were, as we've always been taking on both, right? So we were, but we were not. There was
Okay.
no business model behind the time that we were spending on supporting the startups, right?
Okay.
But we were getting funding very much like a consulting business model, right? Services paid.
Right.
Our work that we were developing and the impact that we were having within coastal community development. And that kept the lights on for us internally at OceanHub Africa to be able to give time to the startups. And the
Okay.
startups that were receiving services from us would not pay because everything was super emerging and frontier. So we had to make ends meet on our side as individuals and as an organization. And that's how it worked for us. Now, what really made, so to go back to the ecosystem and the fertile soil and the fertilizer, if you will, for the startups, it was more the sweat and the tears that brought everyone
Okay.
together, and potentially the fact that because we were paying everything forward, but the fact that there was a latent want from this community, at least in Africa and possibly around the world, in the different geographies that saw
Mhm.
this emerge at the same time, suite of stakeholders that were starting to think that there was something to be done in the ocean space. And actually, it all got precipitated when people realized, I think in 2020, the IPCC, Intergovernmental
Mhm.
Panel on Climate Change, which is a UN instance on climate change, scientific instance, published a
Right.
report on the state of the ocean and how important the ocean. I mean, we had completely overlooked the ocean, how important it was for how it was driving climate and it was sustaining livelihoods and providing source of protein to a lot of people, and how it was in decline and how it was getting
So
affected
again,
by climate change.
it starts with science and education to
And
the policy
with that
people who are
report,
realizing this.
exactly, with that report, people realized, I mean, governments decided, oh, flip, actually, this is a huge issue and also a challenge, but a huge opportunity. Um, even larger corporates out there started placing the ocean in their strategic roadmap. So, and the two coming together obviously supported a little bit, it drew a spotlight
Gotcha.
on the ocean in a way. Yeah.
Okay. So we talked about coastal communities. Now we're getting into the startup space. Of course, they're very different. They have very different needs. And it also means that they have different financial needs. So when you're talking about curating an ecosystem of funding around those, you have different sources. Can you tell us more a bit about the difference if you have a coastal community business that is, as you said, more of an SME, a small business, and
Mm.
not a high growth, 100 million like revenue potential startup, the funding is not going to be the same. You're not going to address those with VC monies. What is a different type of money that goes in there? And how do you tap into that compared to your standard LP to
So,
VC to startup?
I mean, the first question you should ask is, do they need funding, and what do they need the funding for? A lot of those coastal communities, I mean, don't get me wrong, they'll be very happy if you just wrote them a check. They're not necessarily looking for, I'm speaking in a broader sense here, but obviously there's nuances all over. Not necessarily looking for a lot of funding. What they need is dignified livelihoods. So they need market access. They all have today a subsistence and activity and a livelihood activity,
Mhm.
but they're only keeping it small for two reasons. Most of them, again, it's because they're trapped in the informality of their business. Because they're
Mhm.
informal, they're not incorporated, for example, right? They're just running. They have a boat or they build a boat, they go out in the ocean, they fish and they bring a fish, they sell the fish, there's no bank account, there's no registration to the
Yeah.
company registration, whatever. And if you're not formalized, you can't raise funding. You can't even go to a bank and, get a loan or whatever.
Or anything. Yeah.
There's no financing. So, and there's no real hiring either. So you can still, hire people informally and just pay them, kind of, but there's no stability. And without that stability, there can't be any growth. So
Right.
they're trapped in that informality trap, and they're stuck in that informality trap. Sorry. That's one reason. The other reason is because they have very limited market access, whether it be because of logistics or because of what I mean. In the blue space, for example, there's a lot of standards that you need to meet, especially in the blue foods sector, before you can access formal markets. Hygiene standards and things like that, cold chain and other stuff. So all those barriers, which are sometimes admin heavy, sometimes asset heavy, sometimes both, trap those small businesses into not being scaled up. So for most of them, they don't try to raise funding; they're just trying to get better market access, and sometimes a little hint of support to help them formalize their business, so they can start growing from there. What type of funding goes there? Usually a lot of technical assistance and a bit of grant. There's an amazing initiative by the IUCN and probably other large NGOs out there, the NGOs, that are looking to support with technical assistance and a bit of training coastal communities, indigenous people and local communities, IPLCs, to manage their own fund and build an IPLC trust fund. So the problem with that type of funding with the communities is that it usually comes from a top-down approach. So countries from the global north, development funding, DA, development aid, going to countries in the global south, NGOs on the field, or to governments, and some money percolates with a very strong mandate. You can't use it for this, and you have to do this with this, and then the way you can use it within that framework, I'll tell you exactly. You know what? I'll actually spend the money for you, and and that's disempowering communities. Grant it is, but the methodology with which
Not
it's
even
being
considering the amount that gets lost in the way.
yeah, exactly, overheads. Yeah, the fixed costs and whatnot. Exactly. So the impact. So to increase the dollar for impact ratio and to enable the empowerment of local communities, there's a strong case, arguably, to create an IPLC trust. But there needs to be a very strong technical assistance facility that comes and supports and monitors what is being done with this type of funding.
So starting from this realization of the missing formalization of the business and distribution, logistics, access to market, this became what you tried to do. So was your direct action to implement or to help those businesses formalize themselves, or going to governments to make sure that they were providing the support to formalize those businesses? In terms of logistics, did you provide logistical support? How do you go about tackling those problems as OceanHub Africa or around your entire network? How do you, now you've identified the problem, how do you go about fixing it?
So the way we've gone about it is one of the most difficult thing to build when you want to support communities is the trust. So we didn't even try. We worked with organizations that already had this relationship with communities, and whether it be WWF or the IUCN or Conservation International and all those larger NGOs that are widely represented in Africa, at least. And we worked with them. And actually, the idea initially stemmed from a conversation, and the pilot was led by the IUCN, where they had gone into the communities and they had done a baseline study to look at what's the biomass looking like, what's biodiversity looking like in these coastal areas. And they've been measuring and reporting on it. And they identified the species that were, or the elements of the ecosystem that they were monitoring that were declining. And then they looked into what are the stresses of that decline through scoping studies, and realized some of them came, better or worse, from practices led by the coastal communities. And the idea was never to go and speak to the community and say, hey, you can't do this anymore because, that this
The
octopi is
impact,
not going well. They approached us and said, can we take a human-centric approach to that, to conservation of these fisheries or this one, by helping the coastal communities adapt better techniques for fishing and diversifying their livelihoods, so they do not put too much stress or strain on this particular fisheries that is in decline,
Gotcha.
whilst
Okay.
building more resilient and adapted livelihoods to the changing environment. That's the approach that we took.
Right. So that was the community approach. Now let's go back a little bit on the startups. If you ask, this was one of my questions that I wrote down. Do you think that US, Europe, Asian even, or Middle Eastern capital understand the African market? It's a bit of a rhetorical one, because the obvious answer is that for 90% of them, they won't understand it. Now, where I want to push this a bit further is, what do you think is misunderstood about the African market, because the fact that it's under or less developed, I won't dare calling underdeveloped, but less developed, at least in the startup space, is the usual barrier of, I don't want to go there. I'd rather go in a market that's more established. It's easier for me. But the fact that it's less developed also means there is more to develop. So there's an incredible opportunity, which is what you're backing. What is misunderstood that you believe hinders the deployment of capital in Africa? And let's keep the startup side. So what is the reason why there's less VCs in Africa, less LPs also looking to invest in VCs or to set up VCs in Africa? What are the key misunderstood things that you wish were better understood by capital providers out there in other geographies, or even in Africa? Because maybe capital in Africa is looking to invest elsewhere than just Africa because there's a misunderstanding depending on the stage of investment.
That's one of the two reasons. I think most of the money from the global south that's made in the global south by people from the global south that's earmarked for investment is being set in the global north, sent in the global north for investment. It's a safer, better understood, more easier to forecast, and because you don't really control, but you understand the dynamics of markets and investment in the
You have
global
more
north.
references.
Yeah, more references, data points. So a lot of the funding that comes from the global south, that is made in the global south, that's made for investment, a mark for investment, goes in the global north. Unfortunately, it would be radically different if that money was kept in the global south. And all of those performing organizations or high net wealth individuals, no, but we invest. Obviously, we keep some money for locally, but it's foundations, grant money, and it's what we give for food or children, education, and things like that. And this is pure grant. But our investment money goes in the north. So we ending up with the largest chunk of private capital or investment money that's being deployed in the global south and in Africa in particular, because I have that as a reference. I can't really speak for the other places. Comes from the global north, and a lot of it is development funding, or it's philanthropic funding or concessional funding. People that are looking for both economic and impact returns, and are quite strong on the impact. And that's a bit of a if you look at it, if you think about it, and I'll speak about Africa and the ocean space. We asking capital allocators to consider investing into an emerging market, into emerging businesses, emerging markets in Africa, emerging businesses, startups, in a frontier sector, right? Ocean economy, ocean tech. No one knows what it is. No one understands it. No one has any data as to how those type of investment perform, really. You're asking them to invest into, so stacking risk when they have opportunity to invest into known sectors, into established market, exactly. Whilst and with known rewards, right? So the risk reward ratio is not really established from in Africa, and especially for startups in the ocean space. So when you have to make your arbitrage, I think it's pretty easy if your end goal is money first with a bit of impact and all those things. The other problem is that for the larger checks, you need a robust justice system. If things go south, a lot of the transactions are based on paperwork, right? Contracts. And if you breach the contract, you need to have recourses. You need to have
To enforce it.
spaces.
Yep.
Exactly. In Africa and a lot of places in the global south, there are those spaces, but they haven't always had the reputation of being the most efficient. They are effective, sometimes less, mostly are effective, but not really efficient. It will take time, it will take money, and there's a high level of uncertainty. So if you can't enforce a contract, there isn't really anything you can do. You're just giving your money to someone and hoping for the best. That's how it's perceived. And in reality, if you do it from inside, from within, and the legal systems, you can definitely enforce everything in most of the countries here. And if you understand the market and the emerging businesses in the frontier sector that's not so frontier for you anymore, you can tackle all those hurdles and actually have an amazing potential in terms of investment. So it's mostly perceived risk. That's why I was saying if the money that is generated and belongs to individuals or organizations from the global south was invested in the global south, these people or organizations do not perceive the risk the same way because they see what the real risks are and what is just left to perception and misconceptions that usually is a perception from the global north looking down to the south.
It feels a little bit like the snake biting his own tail, because for things to happen, things need to happen. what is the spark that you found, or maybe are still looking to find? I don't know if that's a completely answered or solved question. What is the spark that you found to initiate? Because there are not as many, but there are Africa-based VCs, or
Of course.
Africa-based LPs. There is capital also from the north going south in risk, not just grants and stuff like this. So there is a little bit. Where does that little bit comes from? What are the drivers behind it? And how can you replicate them to grow that momentum to de-risk or to at least de-blur the risk?
Yeah. So where does the capital come from? It comes from the ones that have strong partnerships with local institutions that have very, very wide networks. So
Okay.
obviously Africa is growing. It's growing fast. I'm not only talking about demographics. I'm talking about, the African economies are
Economically.
growing fast. And so obviously there's a lot to seize there from a capitalistic perspective. And nature doesn't like void, right? So there would always
Mhm.
be, because I was explaining, most of the capital made and generated in the global south goes to the north. The north is not, there's not enough investment for the opportunities that there is. There's not enough capital for the opportunities that are in the global south. So the global north, that has the opportunity to more easily edge its portfolio. So they have a pile of cash invested into safe, secured, known markets. Can take a little bit, and from a global north perspective, a little bit is quite a fair chunk, and especially if you convert that from
Mhm.
hard currencies into emerging market currencies,
Right.
it's a fair bit to invest in the global south. So, and they do so with organizations that have very strong network and understanding of the market. And then there's the development funding, right? So there's a for a wealth of different reasons. A lot of countries from the global north would invest in the global south to further the develop with rewards, with economic rewards, but also just making sure that there's development that is taking place, in Africa and other parts of the world, that alleviates
Mhm.
poverty, ensure dignified
Yep.
livelihoods and
Yep.
health and access to health and stuff. So these are, I guess, the main capital flowing from north to south.
Gotcha.
How are we addressing this? We are leveraging those different sources of capital, whether it be DFI, fund development funding
Mhm.
institutions,
Mhm.
or private capital, and you stack them, right? And it's a common thing. It's called blended finance. We've built ForSea Invest, our early stage investment vehicle, that's dedicated to ocean impact investments in Africa. We've built that on a stack of a very strong TA facility, technical assistance facility, with a very wide reaching network and strong expertise that Ocean
Mhm.
Africa
Mhm.
is and has demonstrated its potential. On top of that, we raised 1 million US interest-free loan facility that helps, called the Blue Loop facility, that helps de-risk the investment of the commercial stack that comes afterwards. So it's
Okay.
there to demonstrate commercial viability and scalability potential for the startups that are coming out of OceanHub Africa's acceleration program, or even from outside. And that
Mhm.
is a loan of up to 80,000 to demonstrate, for 18 to 24 months to demonstrate that viability and scalability. And if you achieve that, then you can access the private capital that ForSea Invest.
Because you've had the traction beforehand. So
Because you've had a
it's working
traction.
towards demonstrating that.
Exactly. And we're stacking a lot of de-risking mechanism, right? The TA facility, the concessional investment facility, and then the commercial fund, into which, by the way, we're trying to build a junior and a senior tranche. So we're trying to get a first loss facility or guarantee into the fund to make it even easier and more enticing for private capital to flow from north to south, but also from south to south, because a lot
Yep.
of that global south, as I was explaining, is flowing into the north because of all those perceived benefits, not perceived risk. So if
Mhm.
we can have models that can entice the global south money to stay in the global south, that would be, yeah, ideal. So we have this stack of de-risking mechanisms and reassuring mechanisms to help mobilize private capital. And if in saying so, you need to pause and realize how great the work that we've done is, but how wrong it could be. We are breaking our backs to de-risk capital that is not needed, is held by asset allocators. Obviously want their money back with a premium, or want their money back towards their face at least. But they
Mhm.
don't need it to feed themselves with, the next day, right? Because they're locking up that money for, usually the life of a fund can be 10 years plus.
Yeah.
Whilst on the flip side, so it's money that can bear risk by definition because it's not required now. On the
Gotcha.
flip side, we expecting entrepreneurs that are literally not putting their life on the line, but they need to work for their livelihood. They need to put bread on the table tomorrow. And there's been more efforts globally in de-risking the flow of capital top down, capital that can bear risk, and less effort in trying to de-risking the nursery, de-risking the entrepreneurial journey, where actually people need a lot more support and de-risking because they can't always take on the risks because they can't afford the risks.
Right. So to summarize a little bit here, there's a big work to do to connect the, say, to use big words, uneducated capital to educated networks so that we de-risk, hey, what is happening down there, and then stack the layers of those incoming flows to provide the sufficient amount of capital to de-risk, to get the traction, and to then attract the more traditional capital, let's call it. And another question, and I know this podcast is never about, and will never be about politics, but there's a common theme or a common evolution, especially in the African continent, that capital, at least for infrastructure, is flowing more from China. It's a big development. We're hearing China and Russia investing a lot in Africa, and maybe less well perceived the European or more Eastern capitals. There is always this back thought of colonization. And do you think this is something that is hindering investment from North Hemisphere, more particularly European funding, to go in Africa because of this perceived or this residual, we don't want to sound like colonizers again. Hey, we're teaching you how to do business. That's really not how you want to come in with capital to support. You don't want to feel like you're like there's a bit of a pity. That would be a horrible thing to do. But there's funding from China, for example, that is maybe doesn't bear this weight with it. Do you see that those are competing? Do you see this being a problem for capital to flow down? Or do you see those things working together? I know we're standing out a bit of economics and a bit into geopolitics, but it's probably something worth considering here.
Sure. So, I mean, there's a lot. So first, Europe invests a lot. There's a lot that comes from the EU, a lot that comes from individual EU states. There was a lot that came from the US before the collapse of US aid. So the Westerners world, if you want to call it this way, or the NATO affiliated world are investing a lot. And does it come from a government perspective? They were quite cautious not to create a neo-colonialism approach, right? But they did change their approach where they were funding governments so they could implement their strategies, earmarking the funding for strategies that were approved by those development funding institutions, to investing direct or sharing investment or funding flows directly to local NGOs that had a commitment or programs that were aligned directly with those local government strategies. So instead of funding the government for them to implement a strategy, they would fund civil society organizations to do the job to support the government in implementing their strategies.
Gotcha.
That was mostly cut down to undercut corruption. China is doing is building infrastructure for countries in Africa, mostly in East Africa, and they also fund directly the government. So now you're a government in Africa, you're the head of state. You can choose between two types of funding flows. One that goes directly to you to implement your strategy, to your bank account to implement the strategy, or one that goes into the bank account of an organization that you know in your country that will also help you implement your strategy. A lot of them will choose the money that comes into their bank account, the government and right bank account, to implement their strategy. For whatever reasons. I saw you made a little sign there, but
I mean, it's just the human nature. I mean, this is why I'm bringing more than the geopolitics and finance, but also the natural ethos.
That's giving a strong influence for China. They don't only do this, right? But it's what we're seeing from an African perspective. Russia is different. It's more military and defense and other things. The way they kind of getting their votes from Africa at the UN, if you want to put it in a very blunt way. But Europe and the West as well they are investing a lot in this space, and mostly the ones that are investing into whatever sustainable development and welfare is more coming from what we've seen coming from the Western world.
So I'm being conscious of your time here, and I have to dash off to another call. I just wanted to finish on a last note, which is your VC fund. So opening a little bit, you are raising this VC fund. I believe you mentioned 20 million USD, right?
Yeah.
But I want to also give this podcast as an opportunity for you to have a voice, to share this. How far are you into raising this fund? Will it be a fund that deploys exclusively in Africa? Will it be hardware and software, just software, only ocean? Or do you have specific types of companies you're looking for? If there's people out there listening to us that could enter the deal flow, how can they reach out to you? If there's investors looking to maybe diversify their investment or looking to Africa as an opportunity for development, what should they do? What should they be on the lookout for before investing or reaching out to you? Tell us more about this fund.
Thanks. So the fund is called ForSea Invest. We're deliberately not calling it a VC fund because impact VC is kind of an oxymoron in our opinion. But we are an early stage investment vehicle. Target size is 20 million. We are doing deals from 200,000 to 1.5 million US as a follow-on only for the upper tranche. And we would invest, we have an impact mandate. So if you take the Ocean Impact Navigator, which is the KPI framework that was built by the 1,000 Ocean Startups Coalition, there are four main direct ocean impact verticals. One is restored and thriving marine habitats, sustainably managed ocean resources, a clean ocean, and 1.5 degree. So we look at these four main impact mandate areas and think of our investment in the ocean space always as investment towards achieving those goals, which means that we are sector agnostic, but we would focus on ocean impact primarily with a do no harm with the red line on coastal communities, just to make sure that we don't affect their resilience and we up it if anything. And we have today got 4 quite advanced conversations with LPs. We just started fundraising earlier this year. As I said earlier, we already have the blended vehicle that comes adjacent to the fund that provides interest-free loans, so the concessional funding. We're in conversation for a first loss facility and in due diligence with 4 LPs at the moment. We're hoping to do a first close by the end of this year or Q1 next year, and then opening to smaller potential investors to join in for the final close.
Geography will be solely investments on the African continent or economies.
So the impact must be in Africa. A lot of startups in Africa have their operations in Africa, but are incorporated, for example, in Delaware because of
or
IP
Singapore or
and
whatever. Yeah,
Singapore, etc. We would, or in Europe, in France and whatnot. So we would invest if the headquarters outside of Africa, it's okay, but the operations and the impact needs to be driven in Africa. Or you can be a non-African organization, but wanted to scale out into Africa.
Right.
And if your funding is earmarked for that scaling out into the continent, and we can
So that's a
provide
commitment.
Yeah, exactly. We would also do that.
Right. Because you come in with the knowledge, the network, and all of these things that you mentioned before. It's it's a better thing to take a check from you with the knowledge that comes from it to incorporate, to introduce yourself in Africa.
Oh, I shall think so, yeah.
Beautiful.
That's the idea.
See, thank you so much for sharing all of this this knowledge, those insights on an industry that is developing and how it can translate to other industries, and also on the continent that is developing, the silver lining as well as the opportunities. I think we are 100% with this podcast in the educational part that we were mentioning earlier. I'm really glad we can include this in this conversation. And so, of course, for our audience, we will be posting all of this. If you're listening on Spotify and you want to see our beautiful faces, as always, you can head to YouTube. If you want to share the learnings, there will be clips, reels, videos, short formats for all the knowledge to be easily digestible. And we are building this at the moment. I don't know by the time when this comes out if we'll be ready. We'll have a repository, a website where all the learnings are available to our community so that we can share all of it. Not everyone has the time to listen to 50 hours of podcast and take the learning. So we try to always make things as available as possible. Alexis, any last remark, closing word, any cool things? I think you're going to attend the BEF Summit next week where we'll meet again. So if anyone is heading to the French Riviera in the south in Monaco at the end of May, we will see you there. Alexis, thank you so much.
Thanks,
Beautiful.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.